The blue pickup truck rolled to a stop outside the Pelham Apartments just before 5 o'clock on a Thursday evening, pulling behind it a small purple food trailer that seemed almost too humble for the hope it carried. David Blez stepped out into the November cold, his breath forming clouds in the fading light, and immediately heard the sound that had become his compass. The sudden chorus of children's voices erupting from the shadows between buildings. "The food truck is here. The food truck is here," they cried, their shouts echoing off the brick walls of the low-income housing complex. Within seconds, 50, then 60 children materialized from doorways and stairwells, their faces bright with anticipation, their small bodies pressing forward toward the trailer's serving window. David glanced back at his wife Alicia, who was already firing up the flat-top grill inside the cramped space, and saw in her eyes what he felt in his chest, that peculiar mixture of joy and heartbreak that comes from knowing you are needed. This was not the life David Blez had imagined when he opened his restaurant years ago. He had dreamed of full dining rooms and satisfied customers, of building something stable and profitable in the competitive world of New England cuisine. But standing here in this parking lot, watching hungry children line up for free grilled cheese sandwiches, he knew with absolute certainty that he had found something far more valuable than success. The statistics haunted him: 1 in 5 children in America at risk of hunger. Thousands of families in Framingham alone struggling to put food on the table. Yet statistics had become faces, names, stories. The little girl on the kick scooter who proclaimed her love for cheese. The grandmother everyone called Nana who helped direct the children. The young mother who whispered that this meal meant she could pay her electric bill this month. Inside the trailer, Alicia was already flipping sandwiches with practiced efficiency, her movements quick and certain. She handed the first one through the window to a child, whose eyes widened at the sight of melted cheese pulling apart in golden strings. "Thank you." The small voice called out. "See you later, alligator." David smiled, but beneath that smile lived a question he had been asking God for years. A question that had led him from the comfortable predictability of restaurant ownership to this moment of beautiful chaos in a parking lot. How had they gotten here? And, more importantly, why did it feel like they were exactly where they were supposed to be? The November wind carried the scent of grilled cheese through the Southside neighborhood, and in that simple aroma was the answer to everything: an invitation to feed not just bodies, but souls, to transform commerce into communion, and to discover that sometimes losing your life is the only way to truly find it. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. David Blez grew up in Salem, Massachusetts, in a house where hunger was not a statistic but a daily companion. His father was a gambler, a man whose love for cards and dice exceeded his love for responsibility. And when David was 8 years old, that father simply walked away. The memory of those years never left him: the empty refrigerator, the skipped meals, the shame of free lunch tickets at school. Food insecurity was not something David read about in news articles. It was etched into his bones, written into the architecture of his childhood. He learned early that the world was divided between those who knew where their next meal was coming from, and those who did not. And he understood viscerally that this division was a form of violence, quiet and persistent. Alicia, by contrast, grew up in Quincy, in a family where giving was as natural as breathing. Her parents had instilled in her a simple philosophy that people should have the necessities of life, that shelter and food were not privileges to be earned, but rights to be honored. She carried this belief with the unself-conscious grace of someone who had never questioned it, and when she met David, she recognized in him not just a partner but a fellow traveler towards some destination neither of them had yet named. They married, built a life together, and in 1995 experienced a loss that would shape everything that followed. Their son Daniel was born, and in the same moment, he died. The grief was oceanic, a wave that threatened to pull them under, but they chose to swim. They opened a restaurant in East Walpole, pouring their energy into the demanding work of hospitality. David loved the craft of cooking, the alchemy of transforming raw ingredients into something that brought people together. For several years, they built a successful business, serving good food to grateful customers, yet something restless lived in David's chest. A sense that the work they were doing, though honest and valuable, was not yet complete. He began to notice things the way certain families ordered carefully, clearly counting every dollar. The customers who came in just before closing, hoping for discounted meals. The subtle markers of financial struggle that were invisible to those who had never experienced them. In 2011, they made a decision that surprised their friends and worried their accountants. They sold the East Walpole restaurant and bought a small 24-seat cafe in an industrial section of Framingham. The Foodie Calf sat in a neighborhood of warehouses and factories, far from the bustling downtown, in a building with a kitchen far bigger than they needed. But that oversized kitchen was exactly why they had chosen the place. David and Alicia had begun to dream of something more than running a restaurant, though they could not yet articulate what that something was. They began serving homemade soups, artisan sandwiches, and cupcakes with killer icing to workers from the surrounding businesses, and customers loved the food. The cafe filled with regulars, people who appreciated the care that went into every meal. But Framingham was teaching them things their success could not hide. This city of 70,000 people, less than 20 miles from Boston, was home to thousands of families living on the edge of financial catastrophe. The more David and Alicia paid attention, the more they saw parents choosing between rent and groceries, children eating their only substantial meal at school, elderly people stretching cans of soup across entire weeks. The problem was everywhere, hiding in plain sight. And David, who had lived that reality as a child, found that he could not look away. He would stand at the window of the Foodie Calf, watching customers come and go, and feel a pressure building in his chest like water behind a dam. One evening, 3 months after opening the cafe, David and Alicia sat together in the empty dining room after closing. The day's receipts were counted, the kitchen was clean, and a success by any conventional measure had been achieved. But David looked at his wife and spoke the words that had been forming in his heart for weeks. "We have to do something," he said quietly. "We make food. We have this kitchen. People are hungry. It's not rocket science." Alicia nodded, because she had been thinking the same thing. They talked late into that November night, and by the time they locked the door and walked to their car, they had made a decision that would cost them everything they had built and give them everything they had been seeking. They would use the cafe's kitchen to feed the hungry, not occasionally, not as a side project, but as their central mission. They would take every profit from the Foodie Calf and pour it into providing free meals to anyone in Framingham who needed them. And they would name this work after their son, the child they had never gotten to raise, the boy whose brief life and death had cracked them open in ways that made this kind of radical generosity possible. They would call it Daniel's Table. The name carried all their grief and all their hope. It was a memorial and a mission, a gravestone and a feast. But knowing what to do and knowing how to do it are different things entirely. David and Alicia faced a problem that has frustrated charitable organizations for generations: how to find the people who need help but are too proud or ashamed to ask for it. They began researching food pantries and soup kitchens, studying the models other cities had used. What they discovered disturbed them. Traditional food banks required people to travel to central locations, often far from their neighborhoods. Many required proof of need, forms to fill out, lines to wait in. The very structures designed to help people often compounded their shame. David remembered his own childhood, the humiliation of accepting charity, the way it made you feel diminished. He shared his frustration with Alicia. One morning, as they prepped vegetables for the day's soup, a nurse told me about a parent who came to her crying because there was no food at home. David said, his knife pausing mid. The nurse gave them our card, told them to call Daniel's Table, said we'd take care of it. We never got the call. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. People were hungry, help was available, yet shame formed a wall higher than any physical barrier. That wall, David realized, was what they needed to demolish, not with arguments or persuasion, but with presence. They needed to bring food to people, not wait for people to come to food. so they bought a used food trailer, small and purple. The kind usually parked outside construction sites or at summer fairs. David spent weekends retrofitting it with a flat-top grill and prep space, working until his hands were blistered. Alicia designed a simple menu: grilled cheese, sandwiches, hot and substantial, and universally loved. They chose a low-income housing complex on Framingham's South Side as their first location, a neighborhood called Pelham Apartments, where David had heard many families were struggling. On a Thursday evening in early 2012, they hooked the purple trailer to their blue pickup truck, loaded it with supplies, and drove to Pelham for the first time. David's hands shook on the steering wheel. What if no one came? What if they had misunderstood the need? But as they pulled into the parking lot, children began appearing from every direction, drawn by some invisible telegraph that operates in tight-knit communities. Within minutes, a line had formed. David stood at the grill, flipping sandwiches as fast as he could, while Alicia handed them out the window, along with juice pouches and crackers. They had budgeted for 50 meals. They served 87 in 19 minutes. David had tears in his eyes as he scraped the grill clean, not from the smoke but from something he could barely name. These children were hungry, actually hungry, and he and Alicia had fed them. The moment that changed everything came 3 weeks later, at the same parking lot. An elderly woman approached the trailer, someone David hadn't seen before. Her name was Audrey Morrissey, though everyone in the neighborhood called her Nana. She had watched the Blazers for weeks, seen them show up faithfully every Thursday, regardless of weather. Noticed how they treated every child with dignity and warmth. She had a question. "What church sent you?" she asked. David, startled, shook his head. "No church sent us. We have a restaurant. We make food, and people need food." Nana studied him for a long moment, her eyes sharp and knowing. Then she said something that pierced him like light through a prism. "You're doing God's work, whether you know it or not. The question is, do you know it?" David stood there with a spatula in his hand, the smell of grilled cheese in the air, the sound of children's laughter bouncing off the apartment walls, and felt something shift inside his chest. He had been thinking of this work in practical terms, identifying a problem, deploying a solution. But Nana was naming something deeper. She was saying that in feeding these children, he was participating in something sacred, that the purple food trailer was an altar, that every grilled cheese sandwich was a kind of communion. He thought about that conversation for days afterward, turning it over in his mind like a stone worn smooth by water. David had grown up with a complicated relationship to faith, not religious in any formal sense, but haunted by questions about meaning and purpose. He had spent his 20s and 30s building a career, achieving stability, trying to outrun the poverty of his childhood. He had measured success in financial terms because those were the only terms that seemed to matter. But now, standing in a parking lot handing free food to strangers, he felt more successful than he had ever felt serving expensive meals to paying customers. The math didn't make sense. The logic was backwards. Yet the truth of it was undeniable. Alicia felt it too. She had always believed in the moral necessity of helping others. But what was happening at Daniel's table transcended moral duty. This was joy. Pure, uncomplicated, luminous joy. Every Thursday when they hooked up the trailer and drove to Pelham, she felt something lifting in her spirit. A lightness that had nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with alignment. They were doing what they were made to do. The work was hard, the early mornings, the physical labor, the financial strain of giving away profits. But it was also the most natural thing in the world, like water finding its level. Like birds flying south, the miracle was not a single moment but a continuous unfolding. A series of small impossibilities that accumulated into something undeniable. After 6 months of weekly food truck visits, David and Alicia decided to expand their vision. They began hosting free monthly dinners at the Foodie Calf, opening their doors to anyone who needed a meal. They hung a sign, "Come hungry, be friendly." No questions asked, no proof of need required. Just food and fellowship. The first dinner, they expected maybe 20 people. 70 showed up. They ran out of chairs. People sat on the floor. The dining room buzzed with conversation, and David, moving through the crowded space, refilling water glasses, felt tears slipping down his face. A young mother approached him that night, a woman in her 20s with 2 small children clinging to her legs. She pulled David aside, her voice barely above a whisper. "I work 2 jobs," she said. "I'm never home. I can barely pay rent. And tonight, I got to bring my kids out to eat, and I didn't have to choose between that and buying groceries." She started crying then, and David held her while she shook. When she finally pulled away, she looked at him with an expression he would never forget. "You don't understand what you've given me," she said. But he did understand. Because he had been that child, clinging to his mother's leg. He had lived in that apartment where the refrigerator stayed empty. He knew exactly what she meant. But knowing something intellectually, and watching it happen in real time, are different experiences entirely. As Daniel's table grew, David and Alicia began to see transformation in people they served regularly. There was Kobe, a 12-year-old boy who came every week for grilled cheese and started asking if he could help. David gave him a job handing out napkins, greeting other kids, keeping the line organized. Kobe's posture changed. He stood taller. He smiled more. His mother told David that her son talked about the food truck constantly. That he had told his teacher he wanted to grow up and help people the way Mr. David did. David, hearing this, understood that they were not just feeding bodies, they were feeding imaginations, teaching children that another way of living was possible. Then there was the partnership with the Greater Boston Food Bank, which began after months of persistent phone calls and paperwork. When the approval finally came through, David stood in his kitchen, staring at the letter, and he laughed out loud. With access to the food bank's resources, Daniel's Table could multiply its impact exponentially. They could serve not dozens, but hundreds. Not once a week, but every day. The scale was dizzying, but the vision was clear. They began developing new programs, monthly open markets, where people could shop for fresh produce in a farmer's market setting, cooking classes to teach nutrition and food preparation, and the innovation David was most proud of, a freezer program. The freezer program emerged from that story about the parent who had cried in the nurse's office but never called for help. David's solution was elegant in its simplicity. They would place freezers stocked with healthy restaurant-quality meals in locations throughout Framingham's community centers, medical offices, senior housing. People wouldn't have to go to Daniel's Table. Daniel's Table would come to them. A parent picking up a sick child from the nurse could grab a meal on the way out. A teacher worried about a student could quietly point them toward the freezer. Dignity preserved. Need met. By 2016, 27 freezers dotted the city, holding thousands of meals. Volunteers prepared food in Daniel's Table, kitchen-braised meats, spaghetti sauce, nutritious soups all made from scratch with local ingredients, then quickly frozen to preserve quality and reduce waste. The first time, David visited a school nurse and saw a parent walking out with one of their frozen meals, acting casual, as if they had just grabbed something convenient, not charity, not handout, just food. He had to turn away and collect himself. This was what they had been working toward. Anonymous generosity. Help without shame. He thought about Jesus washing the disciples' feet, that strange reversal where the teacher becomes the servant. He thought about all the religious language he had avoided most of his life, words like blessing and grace and providence. They didn't seem so abstract anymore. They seemed to describe exactly what was happening at Daniel's Table. Alicia, meanwhile, was discovering her own calling. She began developing relationships with local farms through organizations like Gaining Ground, sourcing organic produce for the food markets. She taught cooking classes, showing families how to prepare unfamiliar vegetables like kohlrabi, and how to make affordable meals stretch across entire weeks. She created a children's food exploration table where kids could touch and taste and learn. Watching her work, David saw his wife fully alive in a way she had never been during their restaurant years. This wasn't just charity work for Alicia. This was vocation, calling. The thing she was made to do, and the community responded. Regular customers at the Foodie Calf began volunteering, Marcelo Souza and Billy Key, who worked at a local auto repair shop, started hauling the food trailer to Pelham every Thursday so David and Alicia could focus on cooking. An 80-year-old woman came in every Saturday to help make sandwiches. Girl Scout troops donated cookie sale proceeds. Churches, synagogues, and temples began hosting fundraising dinners where Daniel's Table staff spoke about their work. The Greater Boston Food Bank featured them in promotional materials. Within 3 years, Daniel's Table had become a citywide movement, a collaborative effort involving hundreds of volunteers and dozens of partner organizations, all united around one simple goal: making Framingham food secure. The word spread beyond Framingham. Local television stations started calling. WCVB sent a camera crew to film the freezer program for their 5 for Good segment. The Boston Globe ran a feature article documenting the journey from restaurant owners to hunger activists. Framingham Patch named David and Alicia couple who made Framingham better. But with every award and recognition, David felt a curious resistance. He didn't want to be celebrated. He wanted to be useful. The attention felt uncomfortable, almost embarrassing. One reporter asked him, "What made you give up a successful restaurant to do this?" David had to think about the question for a moment before answering. "We didn't give up anything," he finally said. "We found something. There's a difference." The reporter wrote the quote down, and David wondered if she understood what he meant. Because the truth was almost impossibly paradoxical. By pouring all their restaurant profits into feeding others, by essentially working for free, by choosing poverty over prosperity, they had become richer than they had ever been. Not in money, they lived modestly, drove an old truck, wore the same clothes for years. But in meaning, in purpose, in the bone-deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you were made to do. That kind of wealth cannot be taxed or spent or stolen. It simply is. The consequences of their decision rippled out in ways David and Alicia could never have predicted. Daniel's Table began serving 4,000 meals per week, then 6,000. The freezer program expanded to 30 locations. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when many families suddenly found themselves in crisis, Daniel's Table was ready. They shifted operations overnight, moving from 50 families served each week to 300, then 400, briefly spiking to 600. Staff and volunteers worked around the clock, packing grocery bags, preparing meals, coordinating deliveries. The infrastructure they had built over years suddenly became a lifeline for thousands. But numbers, impressive as they were, could not capture the actual transformation. A woman named Jesselie Swanson, who had been coming to the food truck with her children every week, told a reporter that Daniel's Table gave her more than meals. "My kids love this," she said, "being able to get out of the house, and every week, they make something different. This is dinner, so it helps me financially." But more than that, it helped her emotionally. She was a single mother working 2 jobs, exhausted and overwhelmed. And knowing that Thursday dinner was taken care of meant one less thing to worry about. That reduction in stress was itself a form of nutrition, feeding not her body but her capacity to cope. David began to understand that food insecurity was not just about empty stomachs. It was about anxiety, shame, and isolation. It was about the parent lying awake at 3 in the morning, running calculations, trying to figure out how to stretch $20 across 4 days. It was about children who came home from school to empty refrigerators and learned not to ask for snacks, because they could see the worry in their parents' eyes. Food insecurity was a weight, a constant background radiation of stress that eroded health, disrupted education, and damaged spirits. And Daniel's Table, in providing consistent access to nutritious meals, was lifting that weight. They were creating space for people to breathe, to dream, to plan beyond the next meal. The most profound changes, though, were happening in the people Daniel's Table served. Families who had been in crisis stabilized. Children who had been failing in school began to thrive once they were consistently fed. Elderly people who had been isolated found community at the monthly food markets. And people who had received help began turning around to help others. This was the miracle David treasured most, the alchemy of generosity. The way receiving kindness made people generous. Former recipients became volunteers. People who had taken meals from the freezers started cooking meals for the freezers. The circle widened and widened until it became impossible to distinguish between givers and receivers. There was a man named Jim Bauchman who founded Framingham Street Ministries, another local organization serving the homeless. He reached out to David early in Daniel's Table history, and they formed a partnership. Jim would identify people in need, and Daniel's Table would provide food. Over time, the relationship deepened. The two organizations began coordinating efforts, sharing resources, avoiding duplication. "They've been tremendous to us," Jim told a reporter. "I can't thank them enough. I see it as a partnership." And that word partnership struck David as exactly right. This work was not about heroes and victims. It was about neighbors helping neighbors. It was about recognizing that we are all vulnerable, all dependent, all in need of grace. David thought often about the name they had chosen. Daniel's Table. A table is not a charity operation. It is not a soup kitchen or a food bank. It is a place where people gather as equals, where everyone has a seat, where the meal is shared. The prophet Daniel, in the biblical story, had refused to eat food that would compromise his integrity. He had chosen a different table. In naming their work after their lost son and this ancient prophet, David and Elisha were making a statement about what kind of organization they wanted to build. Not one that distributed charity from a position of power, but one that created space for communion, for being together, for recognizing our shared humanity. By 2020, Daniel's Table had fed tens of thousands of people and served as a model for other communities. Across Massachusetts and beyond, cities from other states reached out, asking for guidance in replicating the freezer program or the food market model. David and Elisha shared everything freely: their systems, their budgets, their mistakes, their lessons. They wanted others to succeed. The vision that had started in a cramped industrial cafe was becoming a movement. David began using a phrase in his presentations: "It's not a program, it's a solution." He meant that Daniel's Table was not a temporary intervention, but a systemic approach to ending food insecurity entirely. The goal was not to manage hunger, but to eliminate it. And yet, even as the work expanded, David and Elisha remained focused on the personal. They remembered names. They asked about children's soccer games and grandmother's health. They celebrated birthdays. When someone who had been coming to the food markets for months finally got a stable job and graduated from the program, David and Elisha threw them a party. This attention to the individual, this refusal to let anyone become just a number, was central to their philosophy. Every person who walked through their door or pulled up to their trailer was someone's child, someone's parent, someone who mattered infinitely. And treating people that way, like they mattered, was itself a form of feeding. The calf itself had become something different too. The foodie calf still served its regular customers, still made its soups and sandwiches and cupcakes. But a chalkboard, now hung by the door, updated daily, thanking customers for their role in the mission. "Thanks to you, our wonderful customers, we have fed 890 people in need this November." Every purchase at the cafe was an act of participation in something larger. People came not just for the food, but to be part of the story. And many of those customers became more than patrons. They became volunteers, donors, advocates. The cafe had become a kind of church, a gathering place for people united by a common conviction that hunger was not inevitable, that food insecurity could be ended, that change was possible. David stood in that cafe one December evening after closing, the same dining room where he and Elisha had first made their decision 7 years earlier. He thought about how terrified he had been that night, proposing they give away their profits, uncertain where it would lead. And now, looking around at the worn tables and the chalkboard announcing meals served and the bulletin board covered with thank you notes from families and photographs of smiling volunteers, he understood that they had not abandoned their restaurant dream. They had transformed it. The foodie calf was still feeding people, but now it was feeding their bodies and their souls. Now every meal carried a meaning beyond itself. He thought about his 8-year-old self, that hungry boy in Salem whose father had walked away. who had learned to measure worth in meals skipped and stomachs empty. That boy could never have imagined this moment, could never have dreamed that his pain would become his purpose, that his childhood hunger would teach him to feed others. David understood now that nothing in his life had been wasted. Every hardship had been a kind of preparation. Every moment of suffering had made him capable of recognizing suffering in others. His story was not about overcoming poverty. It was about transforming poverty into compassion. That was the real miracle. This is what faith looks like when it stops being abstract, not believing the right things or attending the right services, but aligning your life with love, making your work an expression of your deepest values, choosing again and again, in 1,000 small decisions, to feed rather than hoard, to give rather than accumulate, to connect rather than separate. David and Alicia Blez are not theologians or pastors. They are restaurant owners who decided that the kitchen they had been given was meant to serve the hungry. They are ordinary people who made an extraordinary choice and then lived inside that choice until it became not a sacrifice but a gift. Until the giving away of everything felt like receiving everything. Framingham is different now because they made that choice. Thousands of children go to bed with full stomachs who might otherwise have gone hungry. Hundreds of families have stabilized, found their footing, moved from crisis to security. But more than that, the entire city has learned something about what is possible when people decide to care for each other. Daniel's Table has become a kind of proof evidence that systems can change, that communities can solve problems thought unsolvable, that generosity multiplies rather than diminishes. The model is replicable. Other cities are watching. The movement is spreading. On Thursday evenings, if you drive through the south side of Framingham, you might see a blue pickup truck pulling a purple food trailer, and you might see children running toward it, their voices bright with anticipation. You might see a man and a woman working side by side in that cramped trailer space, flipping sandwiches, handing out meals, laughing with the kids who press against the window. You might not realize you are witnessing something sacred. You might think you are just watching a couple feed some hungry children. But look closer. Watch how the man's hands move with practiced grace. See how the woman greets each child by name. Notice how the grandmothers help direct the line. How teenagers volunteer to assist, how a whole community has organized itself around this weekly ritual of abundance. This is what resurrection looks like in real time. A couple takes their grief over a lost son and transforms it into a table where thousands are fed. A man takes his childhood hunger and turns it into a kitchen where no one goes hungry. A woman takes her conviction that people deserve dignity and builds systems that honor that conviction. And a city takes its scattered resources, food that would have been wasted, volunteers with time to give, funds from generous donors, and weaves them into a safety net that catches the falling. Nothing here is glamorous. Nothing here makes the evening news, except occasionally when a reporter notices. But everything here is holy. Everything here is doing what the prophets always said God wanted done, feeding the hungry, caring for the vulnerable, building the beloved community. Daniel's Table is not perfect. There are still families they haven't reached, meals they haven't provided, problems they haven't solved. Food insecurity persists in Framingham and in every American city. The work is not finished, but the work is happening. And that matters more than we can measure, because every child who receives a free grilled cheese sandwich is learning that the world contains kindness. Every parent who picks up a frozen meal from a school freezer is learning that asking for help is not shameful. Every volunteer who spends an afternoon preparing food for neighbors in need is learning that giving is its own reward. And all of this learning, all of this small, patient, persistent transformation, is changing the world one meal at a time. David Blez sometimes thinks about that evening in the foodie calf 7 years ago, when he and Alicia made their decision to give everything away. He remembers his fear, his uncertainty, his sense that they were stepping off a cliff into empty air. And he smiles, because what felt like falling was actually flying. What felt like loss was actually finding. They had not abandoned their dream of running a successful restaurant. They had discovered what success actually meant. Not profit margins and full dining rooms, but full stomachs and grateful faces. Not building wealth, but building community. Not serving customers, but serving neighbors. Not making a living, but making a life. And so the blue truck keeps pulling the purple trailer through the streets of Framingham. The freezers stay stocked with nutritious meals. The monthly food markets continue to operate. The volunteers keep showing up. The donors keep giving. And Daniel's Table keeps growing, keeps adapting, keeps finding new ways to ensure that no one in their city goes hungry. Not because it is easy, not because it is profitable, but because it is right. Because once you see the need, you cannot unsee it. Because once you taste the joy of feeding others, nothing else satisfies. Because in the end, we are all sitting at the same table, all dependent on grace, all hungry for more than bread. And when we feed each other, we discover that we ourselves are fed. This account is rooted in documented events reported by the Boston Globe in multiple features between 2014 and 2020, including comprehensive profiles of David and Alicia Blez's journey from restaurant ownership to food security activism. Additional reporting by WCVB-TV Boston, Framingham Patch, Edible Boston, and Anova Culinary, as well as Daniel's Table's organizational records, confirmed the timeline, programs, and impact. The couple's transformation of a modest cafe into a citywide solution to hunger became a model studied by food security organizations nationwide, demonstrating that systemic problems can be addressed through persistent local action, innovative program design, and the simple conviction that every person deserves access to nutritious food served with dignity.